All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hello and welcome to FOIA Friday, where you can find tips and inspiration that helps you file better records requests and get your hands on the documents that you've been looking for. I'm Dillon Bergin, I'm MuckRock's data reporter, and you all are in for a special treat today because I have a guest here, Miranda Spivack, who's a veteran reporter and author of a forthcoming book on government secrecy, and she's going to help guide the conversation today. Miranda, before I get into some housekeeping, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure, great, thanks. So I'm a longtime fan of MuckRock, and so I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I think it's a wonderful organization. I am a longtime reporter. I started my career on the police beat in Portland, Maine, about a bazillion years ago. And I can tell you that the police departments were way more open then than they are now. And then I was lucky to get a fellowship at Yale Law School for a year where there was a program. Unfortunately, they ended it after 25 years, but they had 5 journalists a year go to the first year of law school at Yale, which was really great because for me, it was something I'd always thought about, but I definitely stayed with journalism. But it added a lot. I learned a new language, basically. So it was really, it's been helpful throughout my career. And from there, I went on back to DC, where I grew up, worked for the Washington Bureau of the Newhouse News Service, then the Hartford Courant for 10 years, and then went to run a series of weekly, very local newspapers that were owned by the Washington Post. And then from there, because we were basically kicking their ass on local news, I got hired at the Post, where I spent about 15 years, all on local. It's absolutely where I'm completely hooked and devoted, which is state and local news. And then from there, went and did the series, left the Post, went and did a series on state and local secrecy. It's called State Secrets for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. And from that, decided really there was a book in all of this, and spent really the last 5 years doing some freelance editing and reporting on other stuff, but really writing this book, which is now finally on the runway and is going to be published by the New Press next year. So that's who I am.
Thanks, Miranda. So we got a lot of exciting things that we're going to come back to you, but first I wanted to go over some housekeeping notes. This conversation is being recorded. You can view it afterwards on YouTube. We also have like all the podcasts you know and adore, show notes. You're looking at them right now. They're meant to be interactive. You can see people writing in them as I'm talking, which is great. In these notes are some research, some links, some ideas that I put in here beforehand after a conversation with Miranda that I hope will be useful to you in the long run. And as Miranda and I are talking, if there's anything that comes up that you want to make sure you keep for later, you do have edit access to this document. You can share those notes with your fellow listeners so that they have those useful things in the future as well. If you are listening to Miranda and I talk and you don't hear anything useful, and you think, wow, I have a much better idea for a conversation, or I have a way more urgent FOIA request I need you to look at or think about, or a challenge that I'd like your thoughts on, you can follow this link to the session feedback and question form and tell us what you'd rather us talk about, what your challenging FOIA request is, or anything else that you want to see in future FOIA Fridays. So please follow that link and tell us what you want to see in the future. You can see some people are already filling out the roll call. That's awesome. You don't have to do that, but that's helpful just for Miranda and I to see who's on the call, where they're coming from, and what they may be interested in. That could also be useful in case there's any listeners on the call who are working on the same topics as you in a different state, or interested in the same general FOIA topics at the federal level. So write about who you are, where you're coming from, and what you're interested in, so that we know and fellow listeners can reach out to you in case you're working on similar stuff. I wanted to share one FOIA in the news item. FOIA in the news is a segment where I talk about a FOIA request that I filed related to something I saw in the news, or something in the news that I filed a FOIA request for before, which is the part I wanted to share today. About 2 months ago, we had a session on data inventories, and I walked through a open data inventory from the city of Philadelphia with a private vendor, which is applicable to our conversation today, where they share a bunch of different data sets that the city keeps. I then ran Klaxon Cloud on that website to see when the website was updated or changed. Klaxon Cloud is a tool that is plugged into Document Cloud that allows you to monitor changes on websites. And so I was interested in seeing when new things came up on this portal, when any new data sets were added. But what actually happened was the opposite. So I got a notification this week from Klaxon Cloud that the portal had been changed, and I went and looked at the link that I was sent through Klaxon Cloud and saw that the change was actually the removal of a data set. So the data portal removed the data set for property tax delinquencies. So these are properties that are tax delinquent, which I thought was interesting because I live in Philadelphia and have been keeping track of the news. And for a while now, our new mayor, Sherelle Parker, has been saying that she wants to do more with the tax delinquent properties and get the sales going again, and they're meant to be resumed in July this month. So I think probably what happened is they removed the data set as they're preparing maybe to update the data set more often because they're actually now selling these properties. So nothing nefarious happening here, but I think that's a good example of how if you're using Document Cloud in that way, you can catch government websites changing in real time in reaction to news or policies that you may want to report on. In the workshopping and questions section, I'm going to come back to this. This is the question that's going to guide Miranda and I's conversation today, and I'm really excited to get into it. Then you have the topic of the week and some more notes that'll go along with the things that Miranda and I are talking about. And lastly, I wanted to highlight two requests on MuckRock that give you some good language to file requests for the types of documents that we're going to be talking about today. One is a request related to a private water company. I think this one is in Sacramento, California. And this was filed 2019. But if you're listening to Brandon and I speak and you're thinking, I know a government agency around me that has a contract or has a bidder or has a private company they work with that I'm interested in, this gives you some good language to be able to file a request like that. If you're thinking, well, what even documents do I want? The agreements, procurements, and communications outlined here are a good place to start. So you can clone this request and just file it in MuckRock. You can copy and paste the language and file it through email. And I think it'd be a good place to start. Another one is this much simpler request from MuckRock's own CTO, Mitchell Kotler. He filed this with several different police agencies across the country, asking for different contracts and agreements related to a company called Trulio, which is using AI to process body cam footage from police departments across the country, with the goal or purported goal of being able to better make use of all this body cam footage that is now being recorded as laws change in different states related to body-worn cameras. So take a look at those if you want to get filing. And without further ado, I'm going to come back up to this question for today. This question came in probably in one of our first calls, and I actually didn't get to it and wanted to get to it earlier. So again, that's a plug for the feedback form. I do go through those and spend a lot of time thinking about them. And even if you've submitted something and I haven't gotten to it yet, I would love to. I'm sure you've submitted some good questions. This one is about a local Main Streets organization. The listener asked, is a local Main Streets organization subject to public records? My local Main Street organization is charged with helping small businesses and revitalization efforts, but they recently promoted a development that local businesses knew little about beforehand. I'm worried about conflict of interest, but the organization doesn't make their board meeting minutes, budget or financials, or other internal documents openly available. When I asked, they said they didn't have to give me that information. So this person wasn't able to join our call today, but I did call her earlier this week and talk more about this request. I have some more insight into it, and we'll get to it later in the conversation. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open the conversation back up to Miranda and I. Miranda, that question is our guide for today, but I want to start more with you and ask you, why are you interested in local governments and secrecy in local governments? You've covered a lot of things over your career, a lot of different beats and topics. What landed you at this book at this time?
Yeah. Well, like the people I'm writing about, it was sort of one precipitating incident that really put me over the edge on local government secrecy. And that was when I was at the Post, and I was both the editor and then later a reporter in Prince George's County, which is one of Washington's big suburban counties. And it has sort of a not great history. The county executive actually went to prison in the last 10 years, and they're over sort of bribery and embezzlement. But before that happened, I was asking for contracts from the county council, which had a bunch of outside contracts, which their peers around the Beltway in Washington did not really have. And I was able to check that out very easily in other counties. But in Prince George's, they were just really giving me a hard time. They wouldn't let me. First they turned me down, then they wanted, to have a lawyer sitting in the room while I was reviewing these documents, which of course are public documents because they're paid for with public funds and put out by a public agency. And it was just sort of one thing after another. And, I was lucky. I was at the Post. We have a great First Amendment lawyer, Jim McLaughlin, who I'm sure some of you have heard speak before. And, they were asking us to pay all kinds of money for the documents. I mean, it was clearly obstructionist. And then they would redact a lot of stuff that I didn't think they should be redacting. And then there was an out-of-court settlement that Jim actually had to write them a big threatening letter and say, look, you have to give this up. And it was millions of dollars and it ultimately was implicated in the bribery case against the county executive. But somebody didn't get a deal. Somebody else got the deal. It was all secret. They settled with the guy who didn't get the deal, but then they wouldn't say how much they'd paid. So that was both the county council and then the county government itself. Anyway, I just got really annoyed because it was among the hardest places I'd ever been a reporter. And by that time, I'd been a reporter for like 25 years. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And so, it made me think, okay, this is one bad county, or is this a problem elsewhere? And I started looking elsewhere and, just found all kinds of problems like this across the country. And, I'm in DC and I worked at a big national newspaper. And so a lot of the emphasis is on federal lack of transparency. And obviously that's very important. And depending on what happens in the election, it's going to be even bigger issue probably. But nobody was really looking at it across the country in the place where, pardon the cliche, the rubber hits the road for most people, which is your interactions with government are at the local level. It's the school board, it's the county council, the city council, it's the state environmental agency. Those are the places where most people are going to come into contact with government, not the Federal Department of Defense, not EPA, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no good tracking of that. And in fact, Dave Coulier, who I noticed is on this call, has analyzed this across the country recently and told the Associated Press last year, I think, that it was getting worse at the state and local level, which I can tell you, even though there's not good data on that, it's anecdotally for sure it's true. So, this is, reporters look for things that other people aren't writing about too. And I just thought, wow, this is really a big issue. It affects democratic engagement and affects civic engagement. People get very turned off. People are angry about government, and it's not just because they're angry about the federal government, it's because they're angry about what's happening at the state and local level. Anyway, that's just got me very, very interested in it. And then, once I started to peel back what was going on, I can't tell you how many stories there are across the country about this. So that's how I got into it.
Well, let's walk back to Prince George's. What if you weren't doing that work, if you weren't fighting that battle for those records, what
Yeah,
do you think would have happened? And I think also, did you encounter people who thought, why isn't she giving up, or everyone else gives up at this point? Like
yeah,
what did it look like on the ground at that time?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what was happening then, and this is more than 10 years ago, why wasn't I giving up? Well, we were the big dog in town too, and I certainly wasn't going to give up. But members of the public were giving up. And I think that's sort of a big problem, which is that, okay, if you have a robust local news organization, and right there, we've got a problem across the country, including, I have to say, in the Washington area, because the Post really turned under Marty Barron, turned away from local news under Bezos. And now there's some discussion about whether they're going to get back to it. But, go anywhere across the country, thank goodness for all these nonprofit startups, but there's very few people watching the store who are journalists now across the country. So I think that what is happening, and what would have happened, I think, in Prince George's, is that, nobody's watching. That's good for elected officials if nobody's watching, and members of the bureaucracy too. So,
And you,
and then
and you
members of the public, generally, I mean, there are some very savvy people out there, but a lot of them really, they don't know until they encounter a problem that they really care about. They don't really know this is going on.
and you mentioned this happening in other places. Are you seeing this in your reporting in other places across the country? Probably in that state secrets investigations
Yeah.
with Reveal, and then again in your reporting for your book. Can you talk a little bit more about those examples? Like what does
Yeah.
it mean when we're talking about local governments partnering with or outsourcing essential government functions to either nonprofits or private businesses? What have you seen, and what does it look like?
Yeah. I was interested in that Sacramento FOIA request because water companies have been privatized in many, many parts of the country. And when I was writing for Reveal, one of the I think I did 5 stories, and one was about, private contracting and outside contracts. And there was a water company somewhere, I believe in New York State, where they were not being at all transparent about rate hikes, about anything. And the public utilities commissions weren't really doing their job either. And in fact, California has a very, very non-transparent public utilities commission. Just FYI, if there's anybody on the call from there. And a guy named Seth Rosenfeld from the San Francisco Public Press actually has done a great series of stories on the PUC and how it doesn't give out all kinds of information, including about sexual assaults by drivers at Uber and Lyft, just as a starting point. But you could really look anywhere about where things are being privatized. Trash collection is privatized in most places, run by, waste management about all over the country, which of course people think has very nefarious connections with criminal enterprises. And it's very, very hard. They will retain the information a lot of times if you want to know, how many trash pickups they missed in a neighborhood, because people, who has that information? Often the government will say, oh, well, the contractor has that. We don't even have it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That how many trash pickups are missed or where. That seems like such a simple piece of information that when it's outsourced to another body, when it's not in your government's hands, becomes a lot more complicated to get.
Yeah, yeah. It shouldn't be. I mean, the governments should be tracking this. They should be making sure that the terms of the contracts are being adhered to. And if they're not, they have an enforcement role. Doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, speaking of trash, we talked a little bit before this call about sewage in
Yes. Oh,
Alabama.
God.
Uh, could you tell us a little bit more about that and what you've
Yeah.
been recording on there?
Yeah. So one of the people in the book focuses on 5 people who I'm calling accidental activists, which is to say they're not journalists. They had no experience in public advocacy or public records or anything like that. And they are very typical, I think, of what happens to people, which is you bump into a problem. You know, the school system is doing something with your kid's class that you don't like, and you want to figure out what's going on or whatever. Anyway, so this is a story of a impoverished African-American community in Alabama that has had a failing sewage system for 40 years. And so there has been money from both the state and the federal government over the last 10 or 12 years to try to fix the system. And there's a guy there who was a retired high school shop teacher, and he's been trying to find out, you know, who's getting the contracts, how come it still hasn't been fixed? This has been going on for quite a while. Are there better alternatives than what is happening? What is the, you know, it's all being handled by private contractors. What are they being paid? And just, you know, very basic questions. And then there is a water and sewer board comprised of 5 people in the community who I have to say have no professional experience in sewage and don't seem to have much management experience either. And so it's really being run by the contractors from what I can see. And they don't give out anything. I mean, I've been to these meetings in this little town. They don't give out the agendas. You know, I asked for it, and the contractor who was handing it around to the board and to the, you know, guy from the US Department of Agriculture who was there turned me down. And I said, wait a minute, you know, this is a public document. How am I supposed to follow along in this meeting if I don't know what the agenda is?
They
And of
wouldn't
course,
give you the agenda for the meeting at the
no,
meeting.
no. And there are members of the public there too, besides me, residents of the community, they couldn't get it. Then they approve the minutes. You can't get the minutes. I mean, it's crazy. And, you know, of course, this raises a question. What are they hiding, for heaven's sakes? You know, why is this kind of stuff? Why are they so defensive about this kind of stuff? Anyway, it goes on and on and on and on. And this fellow who was ultimately was so angry about this, he ran and was elected to the county commission. Okay, now he's a public official. He still can't get information because they view him, the people in power view him as, you know, that he's asking questions and therefore he's some kind of troublemaker and they're going to shut him down, all of which, of course, is illegal. And he finally, after several years, gets connected with a law clinic, actually at Yale Law School and then ultimately the University of Vermont. They file a big FOIA request with the federal government because the state and the local sewer board aren't responding to any of his information requests. And they file it with the federal against USDA, and a federal judge in Washington ultimately rules, you know, that USDA at least has to give everything out. And of course, they have documents from all these other organizations too. So it was, you know, pretty good. But, you know, here's somebody, he had to find a pro bono lawyer, and he had, you know, he was enterprising enough to do this, but most people give up, you know, and it just, I mean, this was this case, and it's still going on, this whole situation. So amazing to me because it's sort of like, you know, this project is to help the community. Why aren't you engaging the community in it? I mean, it seems to make more sense to me that, you know, if governments want support, they would actually at least pretend that they were engaging the community. So
Yeah,
it's a bad story. I mean, it's a very disturbing story. So that was one of them. And then there are some other people that I can talk about if you want, or, you know, whatever you want.
I think this is a good moment to pause also and return to the tip sheet, because I think this is this example really outlines what we're talking about. When we say the intersection between private businesses or nonprofits, or businesses and nonprofits and governments, we mean businesses and nonprofits that are using public resources to perform governmental functions.
Right.
This sewage company, or different types of companies that this town was contracting with, they're performing an essential governmental function.
Right.
And of course, that's of concern to citizens of that town, residents of that town. So like you said, this can happen with private water companies, charter schools, trash collectors, police video camera and taser vendors, and a lot more. And it's very different state to state on how these sort of what are often called non-governmental bodies or quasi-governmental bodies are dealt with in public records laws. And what's interesting is if you check out that link that I put in the notes on states that have different standards, Alabama doesn't have a standard. There's nothing that, at least in the
Toast.
reporter, yeah, no standards, and nothing in the Reporters Committee for the Free Press that they founded this guide on how Alabama would deal with a non-governmental body responding to public records requests in relation to things they're doing with a governmental body.
Right.
Um, it sounds like that then the solution in this case of this poor retired school teacher who took on this big project was to bring it up to the federal level. Can you tell me a little bit more about that case with the USDA? What was the USDA deciding? Did they then pass that down to the state level? Did they have the documents and then they were forced to give out the documents themselves?
Yeah, yeah. No, they did not. There was no connection to the state level. I mean, I think this guy's name is Ben Eaton. I think he was very smart ultimately to go to the feds on this because locally and then the state environmental agency, which was the one that was involved, he'd made written requests, he'd made oral requests, whatever. They just ignored it. And one of the problems in Alabama, and there are some states like this, is that there is no deadline, certainly for local government agencies or entities. There's no deadline for them to respond to FOIA requests or, public records requests. The state agencies, the law just changed there actually. And now there is some requirement to respond. It doesn't mean you have to give the documents, but at least they have to acknowledge you had a request. But at the time that he was, looking to sue, which is a couple years ago, there was none of that. And the feds, U.S. Department of Agriculture, is actually financing a big portion of the fix. And so going to them is a form of triangulation because they did have documents from these other entities, not everything, but they had a lot of interesting stuff. And, that is something that I highly, highly recommend to people, which is if you get shut down anywhere, usually it's going to be very local or state, think about who else has the documents because they're all working on the project together. So pretty much they have shared everything. And that triangulation in a public records request is a really important approach to take.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip, regardless of the topic or the agency that
Right,
you're thinking about is, yeah,
right,
who else would have this document if this agency won't give it to me or can't give
right,
it? Does it touch
right,
someone else's desk? Because it probably
right.
does.
Yes. And you can tell sometimes by some of the emails too, if you can get them, who they're communicating with, who they're copying on it as to who would have information.
Tell me more about some of these other accidental activists, or where their work comes in, what agencies, what parts of the country.
Yeah, there was a case in upstate New York in a little town called Hoosick Falls where, this guy who's an insurance underwriter, his father dies of cancer at a fairly young age. And it turns out he sort of discovers that there's really a cancer cluster in his town, and lots of people have all kinds of weird cancers. And he starts to look into that and discovers that there's probably PFAS, the forever chemicals, in the drinking water. That seems to be sort of the only solution. And there are companies in the town, plastic companies that came in 1955. And he even worked when he was a college student, he worked one summer in one of the factories and was dumping barrels of waste along with the other summer interns very near where the town wells were. And he knows where the town wells were. A, he grew up there, but B, he was also on the little town council at one point. And so he had that information. So he starts to piece all this together and then takes it to the mayor, who, this is a another little town, and the mayor is like, oh yeah, well, maybe we'll look into this, blah, blah, blah. And the mayor comes back a little while later and says, no, we're not going to test the water. So I was like, what? And so this sort of goes on from there. So this fellow, Michael Hickey, finds out a way to test the water, because by now he's read about the subject of dark waters. If you've seen that movie, if you haven't, it's great. And that's about pollution from DuPont in Parkersburg, West Virginia, where people were dying of all kinds of weird diseases and cattle were dying. And it turned out that there were forever chemicals in the drinking water there. Anyway, he finds the name of the company that did the testing there, and it turns out, and he gets in touch with them. I mean, this is, people are very, very enterprising, and it's really, I think, out of desperation. It's not, it's not his day job, and he's got a busy day job, but he's like, why did my father die? Why are all these people ill? And he just keeps going, and he gets the water tested, and guess what? There's an outrageously high amount of forever chemicals in the water. He goes back to the mayor and he says, look what I found. And then the mayor just apparently flips out and says, we can't tell people about this. This is going to ruin, real estate values. And we have this thing called Hoosick Rising, which is to make this cute little town, which Grandma Moses painted, by the way. We're trying to bring business here, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it was just like, what? Which is worse, that people are dying in your little town or business isn't coming? I mean, it's all going to go. Anyway, it eventually comes out. This guy's very persistent. The Cuomo Health Department did not do a very open job. They were very resistant. Finally, the EPA regional administrator says, don't drink the water in Hoosick Falls. And it goes on from there. And, of all the cases that I've written about, I wouldn't say this has a happy ending, because a lot of people are sick, but at least they got lawyers and they got a settlement, and there's testing, and there's, a new water system being installed and all that kind of, but it took years. And they used the New York FOIA law, which is the public records law. And again, totally untutored, had to learn how to do this, had to read all these scientific documents, et cetera. But I think people really get, they get mad when they get turned down, for starters. And then if they have the wherewithal, they keep going. But it's hard.
Yeah. Was he able to get access to records from that company from the era, maybe even when he was an intern, showing where different things were dumped or when, or any, proof to verify patterns
Yeah, he
during
did
that time?
not. He did not get records from the company. I mean, this was not a case of a public contract.
Yeah.
But they did ultimately, after a lot of resistance from the New York state government, got documents, that showed some mapping of where stuff was, but also showed that the state government knew for 18 months at least that they had a problem. And they also just through their own internet research, the community activists, and this guy in particular, found documents from the company that now owns most of the factories in town, Saint-Gobain, which is a French conglomerate. Anyway, that they had decades ago figured out in one of their plants in Ireland that this was a problem. So these companies knew for years, but getting records from the private companies in this case wasn't going to happen through the private company. It had to go another route, which is through the state government mostly.
Yeah. I think this is a good place to pause and then bring it back to that point exactly. Like, how do states respond to these types of records requests? Could you talk a little bit about that before we get into the details? I know you shared a lot of notes on that. How does it change when a private business is involved?
Yeah, I think that states are very deferential to these private businesses. That's what I have found. And this is the trade secrets exemption usually coming up, where they will, you're asking for some document that somehow implicates a private company, not necessarily even a contractor, but, maybe they were subject to an environmental inspection or some kind of permitting, which would create a public record. And most governments will go to these companies and say, this is what we've been asked to give out. Will you look this over and tell us if there are any problems? And of course, they all say, well, this is a trade secret and this is a trade secret. And you should know that Arlington, Virginia, when they did the deal with Amazon for the second headquarters, Amazon got and requested and received permission for advance review of public records requests.
Wow.
And that is not uncommon. I was told by a state legislator in Maryland that every cable company gets that kind of deal. I mean, that's actually something, if you want to pursue that avenue, you could all over the country. There are a lot of these contractors, or, you know, they're getting some kind of big tax break like Amazon did in Virginia and elsewhere and whatever, that they ask for this routinely and they get it. Now, if somebody files a public record request asking for everything that I filed in Alabama, believe me, nobody's going to give me advance notice. Right?
Well, it
It's
sounds like
really,
there wasn't much to see there in Alabama either
yeah,
from
right.
your
I mean, just
request.
my request, but you know, that's just incredible to me that, and that, I'll tell you another example like that. In Los Angeles, there was a company that got a contract to build buses for the Los Angeles transit system, and a nonprofit asked for the records about whether they were upholding the terms of the contract, which included paying a livable wage and other kind of benefits to employees. And the Los Angeles transit system actually was ready to give it out, but they checked with the company and the company said, no, these are all trade secrets. It's like, wait a minute, you know, you got the contract partly because you promised these things. And so there was litigation about that. These folks had the wherewithal to sue. Took a couple years. A state court judge ruled in their favor. They got the documents. And guess what? New Flyer, the bus company, was not adhering to the terms of the contract. So where was the Los Angeles metro system to begin with? They're not enforcing the contract. They're not reading, you know, the reports that the company had to submit. I mean, just incredible
Yeah.
stuff. And that was also, I mean, that was trade secrets, which I think is just used all the time now. You know,
Yeah.
when in doubt, if you're a private company, say it's a trade secret, and that will slow the process way down.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that and maybe some ways that requesters could challenge that. But just to drill down a little bit more on what sort of agencies this applies to, or what sort of businesses this applies to when they're working with agencies.
Right,
I
right,
outlined in the doc, I think it comes down to three things, at least from my reading of that guide from the Reporters Committee of the Free Press: the amount of funding, the function, and the case law in that state. There are some states that define whether a non-governmental body, or quasi-governmental body is subject to public records by funding. By funding alone in North Dakota is one example. It's whether agencies in whole or in part are supported by or expending public funds. In other states, it's just about function, whether they perform a public function or their primary purpose is to perform a public function. So this is kind of the idea that they're doing something that a government would traditionally do. And then there's some states that have multi-part tests, like Connecticut, where they're kind of measuring those things against each other. How much funding does it get? Does it perform a governmental function? What's the extent of the governmental involvement or regulation? And was this entity created by the government? Then there's some states like Alabama or other states that don't have any clear public records law on this, and public records requesters have to rely on case law that gives a better idea of whether this company is subject to public records laws. But that's just to determine, you know, the very basics of your request. If that is true, if this agency is subject to public records law, what you're saying, Miranda, is one of the first things you'll probably hear back is, oh, this is a trade exemption. The documents you're requesting, we can't give to you, even though this agency is subject to public records law.
right, right, right. I think that's right. From what I can tell, it's a pretty common excuse now. And, you know, the government's, I mean, I'll give them some credit. They're routinely underfunded. Nobody wants to be the FOIA officer from what I can tell. It's not a career builder. It's, a pain in the neck to have to deal with some of this stuff. So they're very vulnerable to whatever these companies say, whether the reason they're intersecting is because, okay, it's an economic development deal or it's a private contract, like this water and sewer board has a private contract with a company. And they can't evaluate what's a trade secret. I mean, I understand that, but what has happened is there was a judge, I think in either California or Nevada, I can't remember. I quoted him in my book, but he said, this is happening all the time and it's sort of willy-nilly, everything's a trade secret, so we're just not going to get them out. How to fight that is tough. The government is generally not going to fight it. The LA Metro system didn't fight it. They just said, oh, okay, and it took an outside group to come in and sue. I'll tell you an example of something that was redacted in West Virginia, and it was a water company. They even redacted, they did give out documents, or they let the state give out documents, but they redacted the 800 number for the Public Utilities Commission. It's like, what? I mean, it's just, without careful analysis, shall we say.
Yeah, and to me that's so surprising because I feel like the definition that I've read in federal cases for public records and these types of exemptions is that a something that is a trade secret should be pretty narrowly defined as like a process, device, something very specific and almost tangible. Like it almost feels like something you could put your hands on
Yeah.
or something you could use to make something you could put your hands on. But what you're saying is the way that they are using this exemption is anything that something like that would touch, which isn't really how it should be used.
Yeah, and I think what happens is, it'll take the outside person who's being turned down to fight that because the governments aren't necessarily equipped to fight it. They can't, they seem to think they can't evaluate it. But it is very, very commonly used.
Yeah. To bring it back, we're getting close to time. I want to bring it back to our original question from the listener weeks ago who asked about the
Yeah.
local Main Streets organization.
Yeah.
My advice to her, based on our conversation, would be check your state's public records law. Make sure there's some clear guidance on what businesses or nonprofits are subject to public records, and then think about what you're requesting, the documents, and how they would or would not be trade secrets, because that's probably going to be the first thing you hear back if you get a rejection.
Yeah.
Do you have any other advice to her? Or
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know all the particulars in that case, but if there's a real estate deal or an ongoing real estate deal, that can generally be held in abeyance by the government or the quasi-government entity until the deal is done. And that's obviously problematic for communities that might be unhappy about decisions. So I couldn't tell from that one whether real estate was in there, but that is a common exemption to disclosure around the country. So if it isn't trade secrets, it's real estate, ongoing investigation of some sort, which is when the police use forever. Every investigation, I think the police is ongoing, but so that could be an issue there. But I would think that organization is probably subject to some aspect of the state records law in Massachusetts. It does look like it's quasi-governmental, even though it may be a 501c3, it's getting government, I'm sure it's getting government money, if I had to guess.
yeah. Do you have any other general tips for the audience that you learned yourself in reporting or from the accidental activists?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I say this, I said this when I was an editor at the Post, I said this to reporters all the time. And I really think that what happens is, it immediately becomes a confrontational kind of relationship and you need to do your best to avoid that. So, if you need something from the city clerk, go in and talk to that person, ask them how the records are kept, what's the system, what kind of forms do people have to fill out, which will therefore give you an idea of what kind of records are available. be nice, which a lot of people get very, very upset and frustrated. And believe me, I get that, but you really need to bite your tongue and just be as polite as possible. There are people who will help you if they don't feel threatened by you in some way. So I really think in person, pick up the phone, even though a lot of people don't answer phones anymore, but try all of those ways before you file a request and first see what you can get just because, somebody's either being helpful or they know that they have to give it out. I would really, really, really start with that. And I know it's very old school, but it's very effective.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's great advice, and one that I think we try to always come back to as well. Like it really does take time in relationships to understand what the records custodians are working with, where the files are, what their cabinet looks like, to be able to get these things in the long term and not just have it be like a vending machine, as some people might think about it. It's definitely not
Yeah,
that most of the time.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I want to open up the conversation to questions. So anyone who has made it through this lovely conversation, please ask us some questions, and we'll try to answer them in the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Hmm.
Um, I have one from Angie Dent about 100 audio recordings that the state has from a prison riot in 1993 in Ohio. I have the documents to show these exist. They have continuously denied my request for copies and denied my request to come to the office to review them. They claim they do not have the staff or time to review the recordings. Can they do this? Miranda, do you want to take this first, or do you want me
Yeah,
to?
I think probably they're in the wrong, but and I don't know what the rule is in Ohio. In a lot of states you have to go to court. There's no intermediary, there's no appeals board or anything like that. So, and I'm sorry, I don't recall what the situation is in Ohio. But I know that there is a Freedom of Information nonprofit in Ohio, and I think, you might, if you don't have access to a lawyer, you might try to talk to them about, are there ways to go about this? It may also be something where could you ask, can you narrow the request in some way to start with? I want the first 10 on these dates and see how that goes. And maybe it isn't as burdensome to them and maybe they realize they can do this, but my surmise is they're in the wrong, but it may take a court suit to enforce the law. Also, local legislators sometimes will actually be helpful. If they ask for it and give it to you, that's another option sometimes. And I'm not ashamed of going that route if I have to. It's not ideal, but sometimes you can get help that way too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Probably 3 or so FOIA Fridays ago, we talked about appeals, and I was describing to the listeners an appeal that I had filed in Illinois for emails and had a similar response to this from a local town agency saying, we don't have the time to do this. And I asked them if they can narrow, or if I can narrow my request with them, and they said no, they flat out don't have time. But luckily, Illinois' public records law requires agencies to both outline the time and resources that would have to go into this and offer the requester a chance to narrow the request before rejecting it. So I appealed based on that and then ended up winning the appeal. But yeah, I think, Miranda, like you said, asking to narrow the request, but also asking them either on the phone or more formally in email if they can outline the time and resources it would take in what ways, so that you can show that you're making an attempt to work together to own in the scope of the response. We have a question from Sarah Harmon. I keep running into issues finding the right agency. What is the easiest way to find the right agency? I think that Sarah's asking this, maybe saying that she's not, she kind of knows what she's looking for, but doesn't know what agency has it. I think often when I know there's some sort of document that I want and I'm not sure what agency has it, if I know maybe the name of the document, I'll just search in Google and then add like plus PDF or plus like an Excel file type and see what other states have these types of documents and what agencies they live within. So that's one way to think about it, or just trying to peruse PowerPoints or different things that an agency has posted describing what kind of records that they keep.
That's very good advice.
Thank you. Evie Lewis says this may have been covered, but I want to get super clear on it. I run into the trade secrets disclaimer all the time with records requests for certain companies. For example, Tyson Foods, JBS USA. What is the best language to rebuke a trade secret denial?
Yeah, I don't know if that means you're getting nothing and they're saying that the whole document is a trade secret. If that's the case, I think you have to go back to them and talk about whether there's, some portion of the document that you can get. I think it's very rare that an entire document, and I hope I'm responding correctly to this questionnaire, but very rare that an entire document is a trade secret. It's just an easy out, that they'll say, oh, well, it's a trade secret. And, I think they have to be way more specific about what they're going to withhold. And they
Yeah,
should, in most states, have to give you an explanation beyond, oh, it's a trade secret, for what they're withholding. But again, these are hard issues that governments are really not, they don't want to tick off these contractors or these big businesses either. But so it's not a simple issue by any means.
yeah, I think that makes sense to me, and I think I put in the doc this definition from the FOIA wiki, which I continually refer back to, especially for good case law at state and federal levels. And one of the things that makes clear is the definition that I talked about earlier that should be pretty narrow, but often isn't, that a trade secret is a secret, commercially valuable plan, formula, process, or device that is used for making, preparing, compounding, or processing trade commodities. Um, Emphasis being on that this thing has a commercial value, that it is in fact secret, and that it is used in trade and business. That should be the narrow definition. I think, like Miranda's saying, often you come up against a response that is not that narrow. And I think trying to push to have them describe how it fits that definition or function based on either federal or state level case law, that might help you get at least start a conversation with them about really what is the trade exemption or the trade secret that they think is within this document that you're requesting.
Yeah, I would also suggest, I know in Maryland, interestingly enough, there is a manual from the Attorney General about how agencies are supposed to respond to public records requests. And in it, it very specifically says, your response, your rejection needs to be as narrow as possible, blah, 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 a lot of advice. So it could be, I don't know what state you're in, but it could be that there's some similar manual, in which case maybe you can, go back with a quote from that and say, look, your state AG says you got to do it this way. Can you think about that and maybe rethink this a little bit? I mean, a lot of this is the power of persuasion, or the lack of power of persuasion, that you got to just keep pushing back gently but persistently.
Yeah, exactly. And bringing it back to the law that your state has already articulated in different
Yeah,
places, especially if it
yeah.
seems that what they're saying, even if they're acting completely in good faith, doesn't match up with what the law seems to be
Right,
describing.
right. Yeah.
One last question. Besides for 990 forms, what are other required filings from nonprofits that should be open to the public?
Boy, well, I think it depends. The 990, of course, is with the IRS, and it's always out of date because it's a year old before we get it. So, it depends on what kind of business, what kind of work the nonprofit is doing. But, at the state and local level, certainly there are all kinds of filings with the Secretary of State. There should be incorporation papers of some sort. There may be documents in the property tax records that would be useful. Permitting, if they have a building and, opened an office or whatever, that would be pretty local. But permitting, I always find fascinating, because there's a lot of material. There's often a lot of information there, cell phone numbers, emails, for people who've been difficult to find. There may be, who knows, there may be some environmental requirements that you have to file. There are a lot of, again, you ought to go to your city hall and find out what kind of records do they have, and these should be, don't go there when you need something. Go there when you're just exploring, and not in a hurry.
Yeah, I love to hear that you're a big fan of permits, because I think permits and contracts, I think especially, are just so great because they outline what an agency should be doing or what a business working with a public body should be doing. And that's, I think, where you as a citizen or a journalist can really think about what is the gap between what they should be doing or said they're doing and what is actually happening.
Yeah.
But you kind of have to start with that proof of, if it's a facility that emits some sort of air pollution, what is the level that they're really supposed to
Right.
be at? And what's happening? When are they supposed to be polluting that? Are you getting tips as a journalist from local community members that it's happening at night or times it shouldn't be happening?
Right.
I think you're exactly right with how exciting permits can be if you look at them from this lens of tethering the
Yeah.
possibilities of accountability.
Yeah, I would also add to that noise ordinance requirements, whether there's any kind of paperwork with that. And of course, restaurant inspections are just fabulous.
Well,
Nursing home inspections too.
I agree. We're getting close on time here. Miranda, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and I have a feeling everyone in the audience really enjoyed this conversation as well. Before we close it out, is there anything else you want to share with folks? Maybe where they can find your book when it comes out, or where they can find more reporting from you? What else
Yeah.
should people know
Yeah,
about you?
I do have a website. It's mirandaspivack.com. You have to remember the C in Spivack, which most people forget. The book will not be out till next March. Fingers crossed. We're in the final phases now, which is, for the journalists out there, I cannot tell you about the DNA of the book industry. It's way slow. But I'm also happy if people want to email me directly with questions. I'm usually able to respond to those pretty quickly. And it's, can I put my email in the chat, or is that, no, this says host and panelist. Well,
Oh,
it's my name together. Again, it's spivack@yahoo.com. And I'm happy to respond, to the best of my ability, or send you somewhere else if I don't know the answer. But
yeah.
thank you for having me. It's been fun and interesting for me always to talk about this stuff. And, I enjoy it as much as I hope everybody else did.
Well, wonderful. All right. See everyone next time on FOIA Friday.
Thanks. Bye.